The air inside the 14th floor boardroom of Sinclair Hospitality Group smelled of expensive furniture polish and Walter Sinclair's cheap, overpowering cologne. Walter, the 35-year-old newly minted CEO, threw a thick manila folder onto the mahogany table. It landed with a heavy thud right in front of me. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the polished wood, a smug grin plastering his face. "You're done, Julian," he sneered, his voice dripping with unearned authority. "We ran an internal audit. Your signature on these expense reports for personal mileage is a direct violation of corporate ethics. We are terminating your contract for cause, effective immediately. That means no severance, and your entire 4% franchise royalty override is officially forfeited back to the parent company. Security is waiting downstairs to escort you out. Don't make a scene." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even blink. I just looked at him, slid my keycard across the table, and whispered, "Understood, Walter. I'll be out of your way in 10 minutes. He thought he had just saved the company millions. He had no idea he had just signed its death warrant. To understand how we got to that boardroom, you have to go back 15 years to the spring of 2011. Back then, Heritage Hearth Grill and Lodges wasn't a regional powerhouse with 42 thriving locations across 4 states. It was just 5 struggling, smoke-filled roadside taverns scattered along the highways of western Pennsylvania. The founder, Nicholas Sinclair, was a brilliant pitmaster and a warm host, but he was a complete disaster when it came to business operations. He could smoke a brisket that would make a grown man cry, but he couldn't balance a ledger to save his life. The company was drowning in nearly $2 million of debt, and local vendors were threatening to cut off their meat shipments. I was 31 back then, an eager operations coordinator looking to make my mark. I saw the potential in Nicholas's concept. The food was incredible, especially the signature smoked meats coated in a proprietary spice rub and marinade that customers tried to buy by the jar. I rolled up my sleeves and went to work. I spent my first 3 years restructuring vendor agreements, renegotiating high-interest loans, and drafting the first standardized kitchen training manuals. I lived out of cheap motels, driving from one location to another, ensuring that the food quality and service were identical at every single spot. By 2016, the 5 original taverns had turned into 15 profitable locations. That was the year Nicholas decided he wanted to franchise the brand. He knew nothing about franchise disclosure documents, territory rights, or royalty structures. I did. I spent 6 months locked in a room with franchise attorneys, building the legal framework for Heritage Hearth's expansion. Nicholas knew how much I had sacrificed for his dream. In appreciation, he offered me a contract that would secure my financial future. We signed a special amendment to my employment agreement. It stated that as the regional franchise director, I would receive a 4% royalty override on the gross sales of all locations within my territory, which grew to 42 locations over the next decade, paid out on the first day of every quarter. But Nicholas was also terrified of corporate espionage. He knew that once we franchised, big food service distributors would try to reverse engineer our signature spice rub and marinade formula to cheapen the cost. To protect the brand's culinary identity, Nicholas and I agreed on a unique supply chain setup. I established an independent company, JV Distribution LLC. My private entity held the proprietary formula and the exclusive rights to blend, package, and ship the signature spice mix, known in our kitchens as Formula 7, to all franchisees. Under our master supply agreement, Heritage Hearth was granted a royalty-free license to use the trademark taste, but with a critical caveat written into Clause 12B. The license was strictly contingent on my active employment with the parent company, or a formal buyout of JV Distribution LLC's supply contract for the pre-negotiated sum of $8 million. For 10 years, this system worked flawlessly. JV Distribution LLC purchased raw spices in bulk from importers in New York, blended them at a small, secure facility in Scranton, and shipped them in unlabeled silver foil packets directly to the restaurants. The franchisees didn't know the recipe. They just knew that if they didn't use Formula 7, their ribs, briskets, and signature chicken tasted like cardboard, and their customers wouldn't return. The 4% royalty override along with the spice supply contract became my life's work, generating a steady well-deserved stream of income as our regional sales topped $100 million annually. Then, 6 months ago, Nicholas's health failed. At 68, his doctors told him he needed to step down and retire to Florida. He handed the CEO chair to his son-in-law, Walter Sinclair. Walter was a 35-year-old MBA graduate who had never worked a day in a hot kitchen, never loaded a hickory smoker at 3 in the morning, and never had to look a franchisee in the eye and explain why food costs were up. What Walter did know how to do was look at a spreadsheet. The moment he sat in the corner office, his eyes locked onto the quarterly payments going to JV Distribution LLC. He saw the 4% royalty override, roughly $4 million a year, as an unnecessary expense that was keeping him from showing the board a massive spike in profitability. Walter didn't care about my 15 years of sweat equity. He didn't care that I had built the training program, secured the commercial leases, and hand-selected the franchise owners who trusted me implicitly. To Walter, I was just an aging roadblock sitting on a pile of money that belonged to him. He spent his first 5 months as CEO searching for a loophole to void my contract. He brought in a cutthroat corporate lawyer named Leonard Brooks, and together they began auditing my every move, looking for any petty excuse to claim a material breach of contract. They found their excuse in a series of routine travel logs. As regional director, I drove thousands of miles every month to inspect our 42 locations. Because my company car was in the shop for 2 weeks, in November I used my personal vehicle and submitted mileage expense reports, totaling $740. I used my personal credit card to pay for a business dinner with a prospective franchisee because the corporate card was temporarily locked due to a system migration. I submitted the receipts, and they were approved by the accounting department as they had been for over a decade. But Walter and Leonard Brooks saw their opening. They claimed that using a personal credit card and claiming mileage on an unregistered personal vehicle constituted a willful misuse of corporate funds and a material breach of the compliance handbook. They spent weeks drafting a termination letter, wrapping a standard minor administrative occurrence in scary-sounding legal jargon. They planned it perfectly, scheduling the termination meeting just 4 days before the end of the second quarter, the exact day my accrued quarterly royalty override of $1,050,000, along with the scheduled contract renewal bonus, was set to be deposited into my bank account. Sitting in that boardroom, looking at Walter's arrogant, smiling face and Leonard Brooks' cold eyes, I realized they thought they had cornered me. They thought I would beg for my job, or at least plead for a settled severance package. They had no idea that I had spent the last 2 weeks preparing for this exact moment. I knew the franchise agreements, the supply chain logistics, and the property leases better than anyone else alive. As I reached into my pocket, pulled out my corporate smartphone, and laid it on the mahogany table alongside my security pass, I felt a deep, cold sense of calm. The chess pieces were set, and Walter had just made the opening move. The walk from the 14th floor boardroom to my office on the 9th floor was the longest and quietest walk of my career. The corporate headquarters of Sinclair Hospitality Group was a glass and steel monument to the brand's success. On the walls hung framed photographs of grand openings I had personally orchestrated, showing smiling franchise owners standing beside Nicholas Sinclair. I could hear the hum of the marketing team discussing the upcoming summer campaign and the clatter of keyboards in the finance department. None of them knew that the foundation of the company had just been cracked. I walked into my office, pulled a cardboard box from under my desk, and began packing. I didn't have much personal stuff. 15 years of operation manuals, some framed pictures of my wife Clara and me at the opening of our 30th store in Baltimore, and a custom-carved hickory cutting board given to me by our very first franchisee. While I was wrapping the cutting board in bubble wrap, my office door swung open. Walter stood in the doorway, his tie slightly loosened, holding a cup of espresso. Behind him stood Leonard Brooks, looking like a vulture waiting for a carcass. Walter leaned against the doorframe, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "I hope you're not planning on copying any corporate files, Julian," Walter said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Leonard has already instructed it to revoke your network access. Your corporate email, Your server credentials and your VPN are gone. We've also flagged your corporate credit cards. If you try to take any intellectual property, we will prosecute you to the fullest extent of the law." I didn't look up from my box. "Everything on this computer belongs to the company, Walter. I have no need for your files. I know the business by heart." "Yeah, well, the business is changing," Walter smirked. "We're trimming the fat." Nicholas was a soft-hearted guy who gave away the farm to keep people happy. "But there's a new sheriff in town. That 4% royalty override you've been pocketing is going back to where it belongs, the corporate bottom line. It's time for this company to run like a real 20th century enterprise, not a charity shop for old friends." "I built 42 of your locations from empty dirt lots, Walter," I said quietly, taping the top of the box. "I recruited every single franchisee. They signed up because they trusted me, not because of a corporate logo. They signed up because of the brand," Walter snapped, his face flushing slightly. "And now they answer to me. You're just a relic of the past, Julian. Enjoy your retirement. Security is waiting in the lobby." I picked up my box, walked past them without a word, and took the elevator down. As the metal doors slid shut, I saw Walter laughing with Brooks, no doubt celebrating their brilliant corporate maneuver. When I walked out of the building, the humid summer air hit me. I put the box in the trunk of my car and drove home to our house in the suburbs of Philadelphia. My wife, Clara, was waiting for me on the back porch with 2 glasses of iced tea. Clara was 43, a sharp, analytical contract attorney who had spent the last 12 years representing commercial developers. She knew the inner workings of corporate real estate better than anyone, and more importantly, she had helped me draft every personal agreement I had ever signed with Nicholas Sinclair. "How did it go?" she asked, handing me a glass. "Exactly as we expected," I replied, taking a seat. Walter cited the mileage reports and the business dinner receipt, terminated for cause. No severance, and they declared my 4% royalty override null and void. Clara let out a soft, dry laugh. "They actually fell for it. I was worried Walter's lawyer might have at least 2 brain cells to rub together and check the ancillary agreements." "Did Brooks say anything about the trademark license or the subleases?" "Nothing," I said. "They only deactivated my corporate email and server logins." Walter was so blinded by the prospect of reclaiming that 4% royalty that he didn't look at anything else. He thinks he just saved the company $4 million a year. Clara stood up and walked into her study, returning with a thick blue folder labeled JV Holdings and Vance Realty LLC. She laid it on the table and opened it to a section marked Exhibits C and D. "Let's review the timeline and the assets," Clara said, her eyes scanning the legal documents. 2016, when you signed the Regional Franchise Director Agreement, we created 2 separate corporate structures to insulate you. First, JV Distribution LLC, which owns the proprietary blending formula and trademark for Formula 7. Under the Master Food Supply contract, you granted Sinclair Hospitality Group a royalty-free license to use Formula 7, but Clause 12B is crystal clear. This license is strictly coterminous with the active employment of Julian Vance. In the event of termination of employment for any reason, the licensee must execute the pre-negotiated buyout of JV Distribution LLC for $8 million within 72 hours, or the license shall immediately terminate, and the licensee shall cease all use, manufacture, and distribution of the proprietary formula. She flipped the page to another document. Second, we have Vance Realty Holdings, LLC. When Nicholas wanted to expand into the high-rent districts of Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and Boston, the landlords wouldn't lease to Sinclair Hospitality Group because the company's balance sheet was too weak. You personally signed those 5 prime commercial leases under Vance Realty Holdings, LLC, and then subleased the properties to the parent company. Under Section 14 of the sublease agreements, if your employment with Sinclair Hospitality Group is terminated for any reason other than a court-convicted felony, the sublease terminates automatically 72 hours after your departure, and full physical possession of the properties reverts back to Vance Realty Holdings, LLC. I leaned back in my chair, taking a sip of my tea. So, in 72 hours, they lose the right to use the signature spices that make their food taste like Heritage Hearth. and they lose their 5 highest performing locations, which represent 40% of their entire regional revenue. Exactly, Clara smiled, her fingers tapping the document. And because they fired you for cause, under a fabricated compliance violation, they have breached the covenant of good faith. Under Pennsylvania law, a minor expense report discrepancy does not constitute legal cause for terminating a commercial franchise agreement or withholding accrued royalty payments. We have them trapped in a legal vice, Julian. And the best part is, they have no idea the jaws are already closing. I looked out over the yard, feeling the weight of the last 15 years lift off my shoulders. I had spent a decade and a half building Walter's family empire, working weekends, missing family dinners, and saving the brand from bankruptcy. Walter thought he could discard me like a piece of used kitchen equipment. He was about to learn a very expensive lesson in contract law. Call Donald Gable at the blending facility in Scranton, I told Clara. Tell him to halt all shipments of Formula 7 to the corporate warehouse starting tomorrow morning, and draft the eviction notices for the 5 flagship properties. We serve them on Friday morning at exactly 9 o'clock. The Scranton blending facility was a modest brick warehouse located in an industrial park off Interstate 81. Inside, the air was thick with the rich, earthy scent of smoked paprika, dried cayenne, toasted garlic, and hickory-smoked sea salt. Donald Gable, a 60-year-old veteran of the spice trade with flour-dusted overalls and a salt and pepper beard, answered my call on the second ring. "Julian," Donald said, his voice gravelly over the speakerphone. "I heard the news. One of my contacts at the corporate warehouse said Walter Sinclair's team is already asking about the formulation logs. What's going on?" "They fired me today, Donald," I said, leaning over the kitchen island where Clara had spread out our legal strategy. "They claimed compliance issues over some mileage reports. They're trying to wipe out my royalty override." Donald let out a loud, derisive snort. "Walter is a fool. He doesn't know the first thing about what we do here. He thinks spice is just powder you buy in a grocery store." "What do you want me to do?" "Stop the line," I replied. "Halt all production of Formula 7. Do not load the shipping trucks for the corporate distribution center tomorrow morning. I want our inventory locked down. If anyone from corporate calls you, refer them to my LLC's legal counsel." "Consider it done," Donald said, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. "I've got 40 pallets of the signature blend sitting in the warehouse ready to ship. I'll personally lock the gates and put a pad on the loading dock. Let them try to grill their briskets with standard restaurant-grade salt and pepper. Their customers will spit it out." Formula 7 wasn't just a seasoning, it was the entire identity of Heritage Hearth. The core of the flavor came from a specific type of cold-smoked sea salt, harvested by a small family business in Maine, mixed in a precise ratio with 3 different varieties of imported chilies. If you use standard commercial spices, the meat tasted flat, greasy, and completely ordinary. Our franchisees paid a premium because they knew this flavor profile was what kept their dining rooms packed. While Donald was locking down the supply chain in Scranton, Clara was drafting the formal legal notices. She worked with a quiet, lethal efficiency, her fingers flying across her keyboard as she compiled the documents. The first document was a formal notice of revocation of trademark license. It was addressed to Walter Sinclair and Leonard Brooks at corporate headquarters. The letter stated that since Sinclair Hospitality Group had terminated my employment on June 26th, the royalty-free license to use, market, and distribute Formula 7 under Clause 12B of the Master Food Supply Contract was officially revoked. Under the terms of the contract, the company had 72 hours until Friday at 5:00 p.m. to wire the pre-negotiated buyout fee of $8 million to JV Distributions LLC's escrow account. If the funds were not received, any continued use of the signature flavor profile or name in their 42 locations would constitute willful trademark infringement under 15 U.S.C. Paragraph 1125, subjecting the company to statutory damages of up to $150,000 per violation. The second set of documents was even more devastating. These were the lease termination and vacate notices for our 5 highest-performing flagship properties. The locations in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and Boston were the crown jewels of the Heritage Hearth brand. Together, they generated $42 million in annual revenue, nearly 40% of the entire chain's sales. They were located in historic, high-foot traffic buildings with leases that I had personally secured and held under Vance Realty Holdings, LLC. Under Section 14 of the commercial sublease agreements, because my employment with the parent company had been severed, the subleases were null and void. The notices gave Sinclair Hospitality Group exactly 72 hours to completely vacate the premises, remove all brand signage, and return the physical keys to Vance Realty Holdings. At 9 a.m. on Wednesday morning, Clara dispatched certified couriers to deliver the notices to corporate headquarters. At the same time, 5 local process servers in 5 different cities walked into the flagship restaurants, handing the eviction paperwork directly to the general managers on duty. But I wasn't done yet. A franchise system is only as strong as the trust between the corporate office and the individual owners. The 42 franchisees in my region weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet to me. They were people who had invested their life savings, put up their homes as collateral, and worked 80 hours a week because they believed in the brand I had built. I sat down at my laptop and opened my personal email database. I had the private email addresses and personal cell phone numbers of every single franchise owner in the territory. I drafted a clear, polite, and completely factual message. Dear partners, I wrote, I am writing to inform you that as of yesterday, June 26th, my employment as Regional Franchise Director with Sinclair Hospitality Group has been terminated by the new CEO, Walter Sinclair. Because my employment has ended, the trademark license for our signature spice rub and marinade, Formula 7, has been revoked under the terms of our master agreement. Furthermore, the commercial subleases for our flagship locations in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and Boston have been terminated. Starting tomorrow, the corporate warehouse will no longer be able to supply you with the authentic Formula 7 spice packets. I wanted to give you this advance notice so you can prepare for the upcoming supply disruption and contact the corporate office regarding how they intend to fulfill their contractual obligation to supply you with proprietary brand ingredients. I hit send. Within 10 minutes, my phone began to vibrate. It didn't stop vibrating for the next 6 hours. The text messages and phone calls poured in from frantic franchise owners across 4 states. Some were confused, some were terrified, and most of them were absolutely furious. They had already noticed the changes since Walter took over. Rising supply costs, delayed marketing campaigns, and a lack of support from the corporate office. My email was the spark that set the dry wood on fire. By Wednesday afternoon, Walter Sinclair's shiny new corporate office was about to face a storm he had never trained for. He had cut my line of communication, thinking he had isolated me. Instead, he had just isolated himself in a room full of dynamite, and I had just lit the fuse. By Thursday morning, the corporate headquarters of Sinclair Hospitality Group was in a state of complete operational collapse. The first crisis broke at the main distribution center in Allentown, Pennsylvania. 3 delivery trucks from our Scranton blending facility had failed to arrive. The warehouse manager, who had no idea about my termination or the spice contract, frantically called Donald Gable. Donald told him simply, JV Distribution has suspended all shipments due to a contract dispute with executive management. Talk to the CEO. By noon, the distribution center was completely out of Formula 7. By Thursday evening, the individual restaurants were running out of their local inventory. General managers began calling corporate in a panic. The franchise owners in Ohio and Maryland, who were the first to run dry, tried to substitute the proprietary spice rub with standard commercial spices they bought from local restaurant supply stores. The results were disastrous. Customers immediately noticed the difference. The signature smoky, savory flavor of the ribs and briskets was gone, replaced by a bland, salty taste that tasted like cheap diner food. Plates were sent back to the kitchens. Dining rooms emptied, and negative reviews began flooding Yelp and Google. One customer wrote, "What happened to Heritage Hearth? The ribs taste like they came from a high school cafeteria." But the real storm was brewing in the corporate offices. The franchisees, led by a wealthy multi-unit owner named Harvey Vance. No relation to me. Wait, let's change his name to Harvey Miller to avoid confusion. had formed an emergency association. Harvey owned 8 of our highest-performing suburban franchises. He knew that without the signature taste, his business was worthless. At 3 p.m. on Thursday, Harvey called Walter's office on behalf of all 42 franchise owners. He didn't speak to a secretary. He demanded to speak to Walter directly. "If we don't have Formula 7 in our kitchens by Friday night, we are withholding all franchise royalties and filing a class action lawsuit for material breach of the franchise disclosure document." Harvey warned Walter, "You are contractually obligated to supply us with the proprietary ingredients. If you can't, you are in default." Walter tried to bluff. He told Harvey that corporate was formulating an upgraded flavor profile and that the supply issue was a temporary logistics hiccup caused by a disgruntled former employee. Harvey didn't buy it. "We don't want an upgraded profile, Walter. We want Julian's recipe. If you don't settle this, we will see you in federal court on Monday." Friday morning brought the final blow. At exactly 9 a.m., the 72-hour deadline for the flagship lease terminations expired. In downtown Philadelphia, a representative from Vance Realty Holdings, accompanied by a commercial locksmith and a private security team, walked into our flagship restaurant on Market Street. The lunch rush prep was just beginning. The representative handed the general manager a copy of the lease termination order and told him they had 30 minutes to instruct the staff to pack their personal belongings and exit the building. Similar scenes played out simultaneously in Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and Boston. By 10:30 a.m., the 5 crown jewels of the Sinclair hospitality empire were dark. The doors were locked, the windows were boarded, and large white signs were taped to the glass. "Closed until further notice. For inquiries, contact Vance Realty Holdings." Walter Sinclair's phone logs from Friday morning showed 27 calls to my personal cell phone. I let every single one of them go to voicemail. He sent 6 increasingly desperate emails. The first 3 were filled with legal threats, drafted by Leonard Brooks, claiming they would sue me for tortious interference, corporate sabotage, and theft of company secrets. By noon, the tone of the emails had completely changed. Walter was begging. "Julian, please call me," the final email read. "This is getting out of hand. We need to find a solution for the sake of the brand Nicholas built. Let's meet at my office this afternoon to talk about a settlement." Clara called Leonard Brooks's office. She didn't offer a meeting at corporate headquarters. Instead, she gave them an address, a small neutral conference room in a law firm in downtown Philadelphia. "We will be there at 3 p.m., Clara told Brooks. "Bring Walter. If you are a minute late, the doors will be locked, and we will file our formal trademark infringement lawsuit in federal court." When Walter and Leonard Brooks walked into the conference room, they looked like different men. Walter's expensive suit was wrinkled, his face was pale, and he had dark circles under his eyes. Brooks looked exhausted, carrying a leather briefcase that felt heavy and useless. Walter didn't even sit down before he started talking. "Julian, you can't do this," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "The franchisees are rebelling. The flagships are locked. We are losing hundreds of thousands of dollars a day. If this continues over the weekend, the banks are going to call our loans. We'll be ruined." Clara slid a set of folders across the table. "You should have thought about that before you fabricated a compliance breach to avoid paying my husband's royalties, Walter," she said, her voice cool and professional. "Here are the facts. You terminated Julian's employment for cause, using travel logs that had been approved by your own accounting department for 15 years. Any judge will see that as a bad faith attempt to void a valid contract. Because of that illegal termination, you triggered Clause 12B of the SPICE contract and Section 14 of the flagship leases. You now have 2 choices." Leonard Brooks cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "Clara, we are prepared to reinstate Julian's position and pay the accrued quarterly royalties of $1,050,000 immediately. We can put this behind us. That offer expired the moment you locked Julian out of the corporate network," Clara said, leaning forward. "We are no longer negotiating for a job. If you want the locks changed back on those 5 flagship properties, and if you want the Scranton facility to resume shipping Formula 7, these are our non-negotiable terms." I looked at Walter, who was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white. The power dynamic had completely shifted. He was no longer the arrogant CEO looking to cut the fat. He was a desperate man watching his empire slip through his fingers. Walter Sinclair looked at his lawyer, Leonard Brooks, his eyes pleading for a loophole, a delay, anything that could save him. But Brooks just stared down at the polished conference table, shaking his head slowly. Brooks was a corporate mercenary, but he was smart enough to know when a battle was lost. If Sinclair Hospitality Group went to court, the litigation would take months. In the meantime, 42 franchises would stop paying royalties, 5 flagship locations would remain shuttered, and the brand's reputation would be permanently destroyed by the lack of our signature taste. The banks would default on their loans within the week. "How do we know you will release the spice shipments and the leases the moment we sign?" Brooks asked, his voice quiet. "The settlement agreement is structured as a simultaneous execution," Clara explained, pointing to the final page of the contract. "The moment the wire transfer of $9,135,000 is confirmed. In our escrow account, Julian will sign the transfer of JV Distribution LLC and the Formula 7 recipe to the parent company. Simultaneously, Vance Realty Holdings will execute new, direct lease agreements for the 5 flagship properties at a 20% premium over the previous sublease rates, with a personal guarantee from the Sinclair estate." 20%? Walter gasped, his voice cracking. "That's highway robbery. That is the cost of doing business in good faith, Walter," I said, looking him in the eye. "And there is one more condition. You must resign as CEO of Sinclair Hospitality Group, effective immediately. The board must reinstate Nicholas as interim chairman, and you will have no voting power or executive role in the operations of the restaurants. We will not allow a man who doesn't understand the kitchen to run a food business." Walter looked like he was going to vomit. His hand shook as he reached for his pen. For months, he had envisioned himself as the brilliant new leader who had saved millions by outsmarting an old operations guy. Now, he was signing away his corporate career, his pride, and over $9 million of his family's money just to keep the brand from going bankrupt. At 4:15 p.m., Leonard Brooks made a phone call to the bank. At 4:32 p.m., Clara's laptop chimed with a notification from our escrow agent. The wire transfer of $9,135,000 had cleared. I took the pen, signed the transfer documents for JV Distribution LLC, and handed over a sealed envelope containing the exact chemical formulation and blending ratios for Formula 7. I also signed the new lease agreements for the Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and Boston properties. I pulled out my phone and dialed Donald Gable in Scranton. "Donald, the deal is done. Release the trucks. Send the spice packets to the Allentown warehouse." "Glad to hear it, Julian," Donald laughed. "The drivers are already in their cabs. We'll have the kitchen stocked by dinner time." Next, I called the managers at the 5 flagship locations and instructed my security team to hand over the keys. By 5 p.m., the closed signs were taken down, the doors were unlocked, and the ovens were being preheated for the Friday night crowd. The following week, the board of directors of Sinclair Hospitality Group met in an emergency session. Walter Sinclair's resignation was accepted, and he was quietly removed from the board. Nicholas Sinclair, despite his failing health, returned as interim chairman long enough to hire a professional hospitality management firm to run the company. A month after the settlement, my phone rang. It was Nicholas. He was calling from his home in Florida, his voice sounding older and tired but warm. "Julian," he said, "I want to apologize. I should never have let Walter take the wheel without ensuring he understood the agreements we made. You built this company with me, and what he did was a disgrace." "Thank you, Nicholas," I said. "I appreciate you calling. But the business is in good hands now with the management group." "It is," Nicholas agreed. "But it won't ever be the same without you walking the kitchen lines. What are you going to do now?" "I think I'm going to enjoy the retirement Walter wanted for me." I smiled. "Today, I spend my time on the back porch of our Pennsylvania home. I built a custom, competition-grade hickory smoker in the yard. Sometimes, the smell of the smoking wood reminds me of the early days. The cold mornings in western Pennsylvania, the grease-stained aprons, and the long drives between taverns. I don't miss the corporate boardrooms, the spreadsheets, or the cheap suits. I built something real with my own hands, and when a greedy kid tried to steal it, I used the very system he thought he owned to take back what was mine. Every quarter, the rent checks from the 5 flagship properties arrive in my bank account, a steady reminder of the value of good contracts and the cost of corporate arrogance. And whenever I walk into a Heritage Hearth location as a customer, I can smell the familiar aroma of Formula 7 drifting from the kitchen. I take a seat, order a rack of ribs, and enjoy the taste of a recipe that Walter Sinclair had to pay $9 million to keep.